The low autumn sunshine filtered through the kitchen window late in October, casting sharp angles as I watched my spouse consume his morning meal, his gaze entirely fixed on his food. Nearly 2 decades of shared life had passed, and it had been an eternity since he last raised his eyes from his plate to look at me. In the heavy quiet of the room, the scraping of his utensil against the dishware seemed deafening. Outside the walls, the farm horses pawed at the ground in the stable, but inside, the only reality was the cutlery, the stoneware, and a profound, heavy stillness that gradually occupies a home when long-term absence of communication replaces actual conversation. At that moment, I lacked the understanding to comprehend what was unfolding before me, and the proper terminology for this experience would elude me until long after my departure from that world. This account chronicles more than a decade spent enduring a partnership devoid of recognition, though free from visible trauma, physical violence, deprivation, or open humiliation. I was simply invisible, the way a woman becomes non-existent when the man beside her has never been conditioned to realize that her internal world demands attention. For nearly a quarter of a century, I operated as a traditional caregiver, delivering newborns within a highly traditional Old Order Amish settlement located in Holmes County, Ohio. My hands assisted during the births of over 300 infants, witnessing the tragic moments when 4 of those newborns failed to survive, a position that meant navigating the deepest vulnerabilities of local families. Yet throughout those decades, I harbored a hidden burden of my own. The reality of a domestic life that appeared perfectly intact to the community, but felt entirely vacant from within. These are the personal observations and truths I was forbidden from expressing during the era I remained part of their society. If these words resonate with an unspoken experience you have carried internally, consider sharing your perspective and joining this ongoing dialogue as I engage deeply with these reflections after waiting a substantial period to connect. A hidden variety of isolation does not make a grand entrance, but rather slips into a person's existence under the guise of daily routine. Within the culture of my upbringing, a young girl absorbs the trajectory of her future life from her earliest days, not through written instruction, but by observing her mother, grandmother, and the nearly 300 members of her immediate locality, assembling her expectations from these daily sights. The established expectation dictates that a young female weds early, delivers offspring, manages the domestic sphere, and yields to her spouse's leadership, who in turn obeys the community bishop, who answers directly to the Creator. This path is never framed as one option among many, but rather as the singular template for a righteous existence. On multiple occasions, the local religious leader emphasized that a virtuous spouse does not desire personal validation, but concentrates instead on being practical and helpful. I first encountered this perspective as a teenager and accepted it without hesitation, viewing it as genuine guidance because my upbringing conflated structural demands with true wisdom, and no one in that environment saw any reason to enlighten me otherwise. Consequently, a young woman entering adulthood learns the mechanics of domesticity, culinary skills, maintenance, tailoring, childcare, and absolute deference, while remaining entirely unequipped to express personal desires or identify when her basic needs are ignored. The linguistic framework provided to me entirely lacked terms for emotional awareness, treating personal feelings merely as minor hurdles to overlook while moving toward the next chore. A male partner who offered basic sustenance and shelter without resorting to physical abuse was deemed an excellent spouse, with no consideration given to whether he possessed the capacity to sit quietly and share the emotional burdens of your heart. Such a standard does not stem from intentional malice, but from absolute cultural certainty, a deep-rooted belief that a female's inner life requires no more cultivation than a plot of land or a farm animal, operating under the assumption that basic provisions equate to complete care. The hidden penalty of this rigid certainty is a profound, unacknowledged starvation of the spirit, which served as my daily bread for 12 long years. I had just reached my early 20s when my union with Eli took place in the spring of 1987. He was a few years older, originating from an agricultural family a few districts away, and our connection was facilitated by the community's structured matchmaking system, which gently steered individuals together based on availability and ministerial approval rather than overt coercion. Eli possessed a commanding stature and steady physical coordination, abstained from alcohol, participated faithfully in every religious gathering, and chose his words with extreme caution, causing me to misinterpret his silent demeanor as deep contemplation. Our marriage ceremony took place at my family home with over 100 guests gathered at outdoor tables, and as my trembling hand joined his in my self-made blue attire, I erroneously attributed my nervousness to pure joy. The initial 12 months were manageable, occupied entirely by the physical demands of establishing a household, organizing daily functions, and navigating the shared spaces of a new cohabitation. I convinced myself that true emotional proximity would eventually develop, operating under the assumption that deep intimacy was a fragile organism requiring patience and the correct environment to flourish. By the second year, however, it became undeniable that this connection would never grow, not due to toxic dynamics, but because Eli was completely oblivious to its absence. To be precise, he never exhibited cruelty, mockery, or overt dismissal when I conversed. He simply remained silent until I finished speaking so he could return uninterrupted to his independent thoughts. My expression struck his consciousness like rain falling upon stone, sliding away completely without altering the surface beneath. I distinctly recall a freezing winter night during our second year together, when the February chill penetrated the building so deeply it could be felt through thick layers of wool. I had spent the entire day assisting with a grueling 11-hour delivery in another sector of the settlement, maintaining constant vocal and physical encouragement for an exhausted, terrified mother. I returned home carrying the peculiar, heavy residue that accompanies a traumatic birth experience. And across the dinner table, I informed Eli of the agonizingly long labor and the mother's intense fear. He simply commented on the quality of the meal, prompting me to pick up my utensil and fall into a silence that he either failed to notice or chose not to address. In that quiet space, a small part of my consciousness began documenting the interaction, initiating a silent internal ledger that would accumulate entries for another decade. During that period, my closest childhood companion Martha was married to a man named David, who possessed an innate warmth that seemed entirely foreign to my experience. David was the sort of individual who would call out to his partner across a property not out of necessity, but simply to share a passing observation, a soaring bird or an unusual cloud formation, offering a small, ordinary moment for mutual enjoyment. Martha often recounted these instances with a quiet appreciation that eluded me at the time, as I assumed she was describing standard marital interactions rather than something truly exceptional. Only much later did I recognize that she was describing a partner who genuinely valued her perspective on the world. Observing them at local gatherings, David would physically shift his entire posture toward Martha whenever she spoke, while Eli, sitting right beside me, remained focused on whatever lay across the room. I lacked the vocabulary to define the contrast between their behaviors for a very long time. Throughout those difficult years, my maternal caregiving responsibilities served as my primary emotional anchor, providing a space where my complete presence, capabilities, voice, and background were entirely essential. A laboring woman never rendered me invisible. She scrutinized my expressions for guidance and relied on the stability of my tone, trusting my encouragement implicitly because she recognized its authenticity. Within those birthing environments, I experienced a level of visibility that vanished the moment I crossed my own threshold. A reality I understood intuitively, but refused to articulate aloud for years, knowing that naming the truth would require taking action. If these reflections mirror an experience occurring within your own journey, I invite you to remain connected to these insights, which required 2 decades of personal sacrifice to openly express and share with those who need them. During our 5th year of marriage, my mother-in-law Miriam resided with us for a fortnight during the summer while her residence underwent structural improvements. At nearly 60 years old, she was a substantially built woman with a gentle voice who had shared over 3 decades of matrimony with Eli's father, Jacob. Observing her movements in my domestic space, I noted how she seamlessly accommodated her son, replenishing his beverage before a request could be made and altering her physical path to avoid him without a single glance. She had dedicated decades to mastering the art of minimizing her own presence for the convenience of her spouse, executing this self-effacement with such natural fluidness that it appeared as efficient devotion rather than personal diminishment. On her final evening with us, as we sat together under the glow of an old oil lamp after the men had retired, she studied me intently before stating that my expectations of Eli were excessive, explaining that men of their background were simply incapable of providing that specific type of emotional support. When she failed to elaborate, falling silent while staring at her folded hands as the flame diminished, I realized she possessed an exact understanding of my internal struggle, having accommodated the same reality her entire life, and was attempting to help me reconcile with my circumstances. Despite her counsel, I resisted that resignation, remaining in the household for an additional 7 years until the unspoken breaking point arrived on an autumn Tuesday during our 10th year together. I returned home from a delivery that had nearly ended in disaster, leaving me trembling with racing thoughts about the critical moments where a different outcome hung in the balance. The newborn had emerged completely lifeless, requiring 4 agonizing minutes of resuscitation before showing signs of recovery, an eternity when you are the sole provider of medical assistance under the watchful, terrified gaze of a mother. Finding Eli at the table managing his financial records, I sat down and communicated that an infant had nearly passed away under my care. He briefly glanced up from his ledger, shifted his eyes to my face, and then returned to his paperwork, remarking only that the tragedy had been avoided. As I sat there in complete stillness, realizing no further acknowledgement would forthcoming, I eventually retired to the dark bedroom and recognized the futility of my decade-long effort to make this man comprehend my need for emotional connection. He lacked the capacity for it, not out of malice, but because the emotional faculties required for such a bond were never cultivated, requested, or defined as a martial duty in his world. That evening brought no tears, only a silent, absolute decision that felt less like a choice and more like passing through an already open threshold. I kept this resolution hidden for 2 additional years while carefully arranging my departure, an undertaking that required significant time. Within our social structure, a woman separating from her spouse faces formal Meidung, resulting in total exile from her community, her immediate family, and the only existence she has ever known. The penalty for independence was absolute, requiring deep contemplation before execution. Martha discerned my intentions before I voiced them, arriving at my kitchen table the previous spring to state my departure as a fact rather than a query. When asked if she had ever contemplated a similar path, she admitted to it briefly with visible difficulty, offering no further elaboration. I respected her privacy, recognizing that her circumstances and motivations for remaining within the community belonged entirely to her. To my knowledge, she never departed, and whether she found fulfillment within those boundaries remains her own narrative to bear. My departure occurred in the late summer of our 12th year, carrying a small cash reserve accumulated over 3 years, a single bag of garments, my professional medical instruments, and the vintage oil lamp from the kitchen table. Though the lamp originally belonged to Eli's mother and I lacked a formal claim to it, I took it regardless as I entered a vehicle provided by an outside acquaintance who had assisted my planning for months. Avoiding any backward glances at the property, I felt only the physical sensation of the morning breeze against my skin, realizing that while a new existence would bring its own cold challenges, I had already spent 12 years freezing within an environment that was supposed to be warm. I reasoned that this new variety of isolation was a challenge I could master. The formal community exile was enacted within 6 weeks, resulting in 3 years of absolute silence from my parents, while Eli entered a new marriage little over a year after our legal separation. I later learned he proved to be a dedicated parent to his subsequent offspring, an outcome I sincerely hope occurred. During my subsequent transition in Columbus, a psychological professional identified his behavior as emotional unavailability, a phrase that caused a profound physical release in my chest during our 3rd meeting, providing a definition for an unnamed burden I had carried for an eternity. The issue was never a personal failure to express my needs correctly, to pray with enough devotion, or to diminish my own requirements. It was a recognized psychological reality, meaning that certain individuals cannot provide emotional reciprocity simply because they were never taught that such presence exists to be shared. Neither Eli nor I had been equipped with this understanding, leaving 2 individuals operating from an identical emotional shortage, unable to offer a grace we had never received. This realization does not erase or simplify those 12 years, but it provides a clarity that was impossible without the proper terminology. Today, That old lighting fixture rests on my workspace, devoid of fuel, and serving not as a source of light, but as the sole token from that era that does not evoke a sense of grief. Instead, it serves as a reminder of a woman who sat across from me and conveyed the ultimate truth of her reality as clearly as she could manage, demonstrating that she was merely doing the best she could with the limited tools provided to her. We all navigate life with what we are given, just as I did until choosing to seek a different path. Whether you have remained in a difficult situation longer than intended, are currently navigating the choice to stay, or are just beginning to realize that your efforts have been an exhausting labor to find acceptance from someone incapable of giving it, know that your desire for true connection is completely valid. If this perspective speaks to your journey, consider sharing your thoughts on the specific echoes of this isolation and whether you have navigated that profound loneliness of sharing a space with someone while remaining entirely solitary. You were never asking for too much. You were simply requesting something that an emotionally limited individual was incapable of providing, and recognizing that distinction is what separates a complete life from a partial existence. The internal strength I carried out of that traditional world remains with me today.